today as we have this wonderful event that is directly related to race relations in our country and particularly related to our churches. I want to say what a privilege it is to be part of a church that would take on this important matter. I know that Wendy Campbell from our own United Methodist Women and Karen Shuey and many working behind the scenes have been very, very important to this process, and we're happy to be joined today by a couple who are coming from the Metro District. That's Miss Barbara Weaver and Miss Rosie Taylor from Walnut Hill Church that is a partner church with Lover's Lane. I want to say that this event has been in the making for several months, in fact over a year. We've been talking about doing an event such as this related to race relations and where the church is. And about a year ago, or in January, some of our United Methodist women heard Miss Colette speak, and they were so very impressed with what she had to say. They said, we have to get her here. And then COVID hit, and so we got delayed even more. But we are so glad to have this event going on today. You know, I want to say as United Methodists, we are going on to perfection, aren't we? We believe that the Holy Spirit's working in our lives to bring about a more perfect love. And when it comes to matters that we'll be addressing today, I hope that we can address it in the spirit of our Wesleyan heritage, that we can do better. And the Holy Spirit wants to work with us to get to a better place as individuals, as a nation, as a church. And so may God bless us, and we'll be praying that the Holy Spirit moves in a powerful way today through this event, that we can make decisions about how we move forward and know that we're in keeping with God's grace and God's will for our lives. Thank you.
Are we on? No, I'm not on the screen. Good afternoon. I'm Wendy Campbell, president of the Bold Women of Lover's Lane, a group of United Methodist women.
And I'm Barbara Weaver. I am the president of Metro District United Methodist Women in the North Texas Conference.
Today's program is presented by the Bold Women of Lover's Lane, and we're so glad that you have all joined with us today for this bold conversation.
And now, let's have a prayer from our own Rosie Taylor.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we are in the midst of severe storms, both literally and figuratively, and we thank you for your presence and care at all times. Although so much is not in our hands, we know that you alone hold all of us in your hands. Help us to hold on to this faith with trust and obedience to your guidance and your will. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Rosie. We have asked Colette Pinchon Battle to lead the conversation today because her work and her message focus so much on many of the issues that we prioritize as United Methodist women. Today, the focus is specifically race and climate, two concerns that are like storms affecting so many people.
Colette is the founder and executive director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, developing and programming on equitable disaster recovery, global migration, community economics, climate justice, and energy democracy.
You know, she works with local communities, national funders, and elected officials while managing the center's legal services in immigration law and disaster law.
She is an Obama Fellow and a TED Fellow, has an honorary doctorate, and too many awards to mention. So let's not hold up. Let's let Colette do the talking.
Welcome, Colette.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Wendy. And Miss Ms. Weaver. I really appreciate the generous and gracious introduction. And thank you, Pastor, for reminding all of us that we're striving for a more perfect love. That hit my heart really well. My name is Colette Pinchon Battle. As you heard, I'm the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy. I'm calling you from Slidell, Louisiana today. And I want to thank the organizers of this event. I was able to talk to Miss Wendy and so many of the women a long time ago. And it seems like a lifetime ago, about coming to Dallas, about speaking with this group of women, about being a part of this conversation. And well, we've had some major changes in our country that have allowed us all to now participate virtually. So I want to just offer my sincere thank you and gratitude for those of you who are joining virtually, who are still taking the time to meditate on this beautiful Sunday. It's a nice rainy day here in South Louisiana. And I'm calling you from the original land of the Choctaw people, the Homa people, and the Biloxi people. And I just want to offer my gratitude for being able to live my life on this land that I realize has been stolen and has not been accounted for. I make that introduction because so many of us are living on lands of nations and peoples that we don't even know. And I want to encourage those of you who can hear the sound of my voice to find out who are the original people of the lands that you're on, and how can you make just a daily offering, even if it's good intentions, to the people on whose lands you are now able to remain. This conversation is about severe storms, and what a perfect title. I didn't come up with it, but I really resonate with it. The work that I do in climate change and the work that I do around climate justice, specifically focusing on communities of color on the front line of climate change in the Gulf South, comes from a severe storm, and it comes from Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina occurred 15 years ago this year, 2005. We just commemorated 15 years of recovery. And I remember right after it happened, folks saying it was going to take 15 to 20 years for not just the city of New Orleans, but the entire Gulf South to come back as strong as it was before. And in fact, it has taken all of that time, and I know it will take a lot more. But it was really in the beginning of this disaster recovery that I began to ask some questions about this severe storm that was Katrina. Who has a right to recover from this storm? Who has a right to return from being displaced from the storm? Who has a right to remain in the midst of the storms that are to come? And who has the ability to do these things? Where does the authority, where does the access come in from? These questions were only asked after a lot of really naive assumptions. I assumed, one, that a storm that bad would never hit. I assumed that I had a government that was going to respond to its people, especially in their deepest time of need. I had an assumption that we would be able to recover from a disaster the way anybody would, on equal footing, on equal terms. And all of those assumptions turned out to be incorrect. The storm has hit. And if you're one of those folks thinking that a storm like Katrina will never hit you or your family or your community, I'm here to offer you with love a sobering reminder that some of us who believed it could never happen to us are now living through 15 years of recovery. If not a hurricane, there is a climate impact coming your way, and it's time for us to prepare. I also want to acknowledge my naivete around what recovery would look like. The assumption that my government would show up for its people and ensure a recovery at the federal and state level that was accessible to all people was just not the case. Over and over again, when I looked at who was struggling to come back, who was struggling to recover, it was the poorest people, the Blackest people, and the folks in my community who could not return. And so I want to just offer this analysis as my starting point to understanding climate change. I was not a climate activist. I didn't have the reading or the science on any of this stuff. This is just from watching recovery happen and really ask some questions about what's going on. And more importantly, what's coming next. So when I looked at the through line and I started thinking about who is able to recover, who is able to remain, who has access to decision makers, the question of race appeared very boldly. And, it's not something I would say I knew I had a deep analysis about. I'm a Black woman. I live in the United States. Of course, I understand race and racism, but I wasn't understanding why a system of recovery would not allow for everybody to recover the same. I wasn't understanding how broken the systems were until I was in the midst of them. And I understood some very critical tensions. One, that race is a social construct, that it's not real, and it has no biological basis. That took me a long time to learn. As a Black woman in this country, I can feel race, I can feel racism. I know how can it not be real? But it's a social construct. Man made it, humans made it. And because it's a social construct, because humans made it, it can shift over time. So we see folks who were at one time in US history labeled as one thing, at a different time in US history can be labeled something else. I think about the Irish, the Italians, and the Jews, who were once distinct races in this country, but are now all considered white. This type of shift is something that'll drive you a little crazy if you're not paying attention. And it'll drive you crazy because this thing that is not real is a tool of power and has been used as a tool of oppression over and over again. It's hard to pin down, it moves. And if you're not in the mainstream, you're not even part of the group determining who gets to be white and who doesn't get to be white. And so this became just a starting point for me to understand the discrepancies in recovery, to understand who was being given the opportunity to talk to decision makers, to be a part of decisions being made in the worst disaster to ever hit our country. There was a lot of outpouring, there was a lot of goodwill, but what I saw was injustice, inequity, and certainly no real desire to fix a system that was simply maintaining all of the brokenness that existed before the storm. Race is not real. It shifts over time. It's determined by the mainstream, but it has real consequences. And it's those pieces, that understanding that race is not real, but it has real consequences that I've had, that's the tension that I've had to hold and try to hold as I make these assessments of what's going on the ground, especially in climate disaster recovery. So what are some race consequences? Of course, for me, someone not liking you, right? That's sort of individual racism. A consequence of me being a Black woman in America is that some people, without ever getting to know me, won't like me. And that individual racism is hard. It's painful, but you can move past it. But there's a bigger piece that I don't know that we've acknowledged until really this year with all of the uprisings and the bold conversations that are happening, which is that there's a system of racialized structures in place that maintain our society. The Aspen Institute uses the term structural racism to describe a system that reinforces group inequity. It has subtle and racialized patterns, and it generates differences in well-being between people who are white and people who are not white. Now, this isn't something that's just being thrown out there. This is something that's been studied. How is it that certain groups of people have different life determinants when they have access to the same things? Well, that's the question, and I think that's often the answer. They don't have access to the same things, and the disparate impacts that we're seeing in things like health are becoming very clear now, especially in a time of COVID, in a time of disaster. We have another storm in the Gulf, another one in the Gulf today. We are now on the second round of naming storms, meaning they've gone through 23 and now they're coming back around again. This is real. What's happening is real. And what we need to do is acknowledge that the systems of recovery that deny so many people the ability to engage is now denying our ability to become more resilient in the face of what's coming, both in the recovery, but also in a recovery that helps prepare us for a more resilient reality going forward as climate continues to shift. But before I get into climate change, which I hope is all right, my intention here is absolutely to talk about climate change. But before I get into climate change, I want to talk a little bit more about the race consequences that I've had to really think through. One is thinking about the land that we're on, the land of this country, land ownership and colonization, and how race consequences really connect all the way back to the beginning of this country. In a land where entire nations of peoples were here, living, working, raising their families, we now have a country that has all but committed really genocide against Native Americans and indigenous nations whose land we're all on and all benefiting from. Now, this, of course, will make a lot of people uncomfortable. Well, what do you mean? I own my house. I worked for this. I worked really hard. But there's a question here that has to be asked, which is whose right? Who gave the right for that land to be called yours? How did that happen? What were the steps that led up to this land now being in your possession? Land ownership, as it turns out, is not a very indigenous notion. To own a tree or a river or a mountain or land or a stream is not something that many indigenous nations think about. While there's a lot in common with the Christian understanding of stewardship, the understanding of ownership is not rooted in God, it's rooted in capitalism. And capitalism is a part of this conversation. We'll talk a little bit more about the economic drivers of this country, but it's important to just start asking questions. Whose land am I on? Whose land should I acknowledge? Whose land should I have permission to be here for? And so I want to just bring in the fact that it wasn't just that land was taken, because that is certainly, for all the lawyers out there, theft, robbery even, but you know, it doesn't have to be worse than that, but it was worse than that. It wasn't just a simple taking of land or territory. This was coupled with genocide, murder, rape, all of these things that we know as Christians should not be part of the story we tell about how we got to where we are and how we have what we have, but it is part of our American story. It's part of the history of this country. It's hard to admit, but it doesn't make it less of the truth. It is the truth of where we are and what we have. And if we don't understand the foundation on which we're standing, we won't really understand how to fix some of the systems that keep popping up and showing us they're here, they're broken, and they need our attention. As I think about race consequences, I think about poverty. And I'll tell you, poverty in the aftermath of Katrina was a terrible thing to witness. For those who are now struggling in COVID and in this reality that we find ourselves in 2020, it reminds me a lot of Katrina and the aftermath and the recovery. So many people living paycheck to paycheck, so many people who are paid just enough to be poor and indentured to their job, but not wealthy enough to protect their families, protect themselves, and to have what's needed when you have to get out of the way of a storm, get out of the path of harm, or even, as I send prayers and love to our brothers and sisters on the West Coast, even move from fire or flooding, sending prayers to our family in the Midwest. You've got to have the ability to move away from these things that are causing harm. But it really, the basis of that understanding is access to power, access to wealth, access to the ability to be able to recover. Don't we all have the right to recover? I think we do. And I think we have to understand that the inability for everybody to recover equally right now from disasters that we're seeing in 2020 goes all the way back to a history that began at the beginning of this country. The poverty consequences of the South are not inextricable from a moment in time that many Americans would like to forget about. It's important for you to understand that according to the 2010 census, the poorest states in the United States are, and I'll read them in order: Mississippi, Arkansas, Kentucky, West Virginia, New Mexico, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, when I read those states out, some folks would be really proud. You know, we're not the poorest. We're number 10. We're not on the list. But there's a different question that we should ask, not just about where are we situated, but why are these 10 states situated where they are? Why are these the states that are the poorest? If you recognize these states, you'll acknowledge that 8 of 10 of them are in the US South. And there's a history of the US South that is absolutely connected to economics, income, and wealth of this nation. And that is the history of slavery. And it wasn't just slavery, right? Because a lot of folks like to say, oh, slavery was always around. Let's have that argument another day. But assuming that's true, let's be clear about what type of slavery was used in the United States to build this country. It's called chattel slavery. It means that you are dehumanized legally. You have no human rights because you're not even acknowledged as a human. Now, did we know folks were human when we took them from Africa and enslaved them here? Yes, we did. Yes, we did. We used legal systems. We used the structures that we had to actually take away the humanity of people and turn them into products that can be bought and sold and owned by another person. This is the root of our country's wealth. The dollars and the wealth created from the slave economy can be seen throughout the United States now. And the wealth that was built on top of the slave economy was built with an indentured economy, an indentured workforce, just subject to servitudes that were a lot like slavery, if not just a continuation of it. And this brings me to a point around the racial wealth divide as another race consequence, right? It's not real, but there are race consequences. The poorest states in this country are the states that are rooted in a slave economy, the states that have the largest Black populations. This is not just about individual action. This is about legacy. This is about legacy, and the legacy of what we did a long time ago still showing up today. Black people aren't poor because they're not working hard enough. I mean, that's not what's happening here. Latino people aren't poor because they're not working hard enough. That is, that is not what's happening here. What is happening is that there's a system that will never allow these groups of people that have been so undervalued to ever be valued equally and or catch up and or actually be restored to the wealth that they are entitled to for work that has been done over generations without ever being paid and given to other people to have. This is an important analysis around understanding poverty as not just individual choices, but structured systems to keep those the hierarchy of race in place. That structural racism specifically keeps the hierarchy of race in place. The racial wealth divide, a study done in 2016, says that if you look at wealth and how wealth is going to grow over 50 years, there's a study done from 1983 to 2043. So using past data and where you're going next, the data says white wealth will continue on an upward incline. And in 2043, white wealth for just in general will be around an average of $1.2 million. That's an average white family, and the wealth, which includes the assets, not just their income, but the wealth that they have been able to generate. That same study looks at Latinos and Blacks. And that study says that while whites will reach $1.2 million in their wealth by 2043 as a whole, as a group, Latinos will reach 165,000 for their household. So 1.2 million to 165,000. This is a gap between how much wealth white folks will have in 2043 and how much wealth Latino folks will have in 2043. But let's be clear, the Latinos will have more wealth than the Black folks because the projections show that Black wealth is not presupposed to do anything other than stay flat, literally coming in at just over $100,000 in 2043. The wealth of a Black family at $100,000, the wealth of a Latino family at $165,000, the wealth of a white family at $1.2 million. This is just looking at the data and the trajectory. The racial wealth divide is real. And the people who have access to wealth have access to recovery from climate disaster. We've got to trace this all the way back, or else we'll hear climate change and disaster recovery as more about personal and individual choices, when what we need to understand is that this is about systems change, whole systems change, or else we're not going to make it out of this thing. When I think about the racial wealth divide and I think about race consequences, I think about another race consequence that has gotten a lot of attention over the past few years, and that is mass incarceration. Because when I understood climate change was really 5 years after Katrina, during the BP oil drilling disaster. And let me just acknowledge that yesterday makes 10 years since they capped the Deepwater Horizon leak. 87 days in the Gulf, over 200 million gallons of heavy crude oil spewed into the ocean and bubbled up to the surface, and much of it ended up on the shores of Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and even Florida. This Deepwater Horizon was doing deep water fracking, drilling in some of the deepest ocean area you've ever contemplated, drilling for oil, drilling for gas, drilling for these things that are coming from deep places of the earth and spewing out hundreds of toxins and gases into both the water and the air. But it wasn't really drilling that got me. I'm from South Louisiana. Everybody I know works in oil and gas. I'm from an oil and gas family. It's just a reality here. What I was confused about was not the explosion, but rather the cleanup and recovery of that explosion. As the oil washed on the shores in different states, what you could see was certain people being allowed to get free training on hazardous materials, and other people having no training, no safety gear, and being asked to clean up the oil that was washing onto the shores. The people who were allowed to go to the training, the free trainings at the public libraries, were often sort of the middle-class, white, targeted, working class folks. Hey, everybody, we're gonna make sure you know you've got this information and you go there. And if you went into any of the auditoriums where folks were getting their training and making their application, you would be hard-pressed to find people of color anywhere in that space. I'm not saying there weren't one or two, I'm just saying there weren't very many. But where you did see people of color engaged in the BP oil drilling disaster cleanup was the prison labor used to pick up the oil off the shores of many of the beaches. And every year on April 20th, I check to see who has taken pictures down in South Louisiana and confirmed that, yes, there is still oil washing up 10 years later. But when I think about that prison labor, it made me understand two things. If mass incarceration is a problem, and the 13th Amendment allows for slavery to exist in prisons, then what we're actually seeing is slave labor cleaning up oil and oil disasters from our shore. Now, this is where my understanding of climate my understanding of race and my understanding of justice really firmed up. Why is it that prison labor can be used? And why is it that when we use prison labor, they don't get the safety equipment that they need? They don't get the protective gear that they need. To hear the conversations about protective gear in our country right now, who has access to PPE, when I can see athletes having full access to bubbles and PPE, and then I see health workers still just fledgling looking for basic masks and gloves and things needed for surgery and to save people's lives. I wonder, where are we as a country when this is okay? Where are we as Christians when this is okay? The exploitation of labor is not new. And the exploitation of these prisoners to clean up oil off the sands of the Gulf South shores is not new. It is rooted in a system that was here since the beginning. It is rooted in a system that has built the wealth of this country. It is rooted in a system that exploits labor and extracts everything possible, even when that extraction is people, even when that extraction is oil and gas. This philosophy of extraction is the basis. It is the basis of our economic the driver of this country. It is the basis of the wealth divide. It is the basis of poverty. We are dealing with an economic philosophy that necessarily oppresses labor, people, communities, and environment. And it is now caught up to us, and it is called climate change. I think about the long-term calls for labor rights and workers' rights, something I didn't understand until after Katrina, when I saw labor rights and workers' rights actually suspended in the name of getting the economy back running. So let's let the workers be exposed to all sorts of things so long as we get the economy up and running quicker. Does it sound familiar? Does it sound familiar that we would literally put the lives of people to sacrifice to build this economy out, when this economy, all since the very beginning, has been rooted in something sinister, hateful, malicious, and not Christian? I'm not going to put my faith and this economy together. They don't go together. Because my faith tells me we must value all humans the same. And this economic system is the exact opposite of that. In fact, it says we should value some folks higher than others, and we should value some people not at all. And that, I do not believe, is part of the faith that I follow. So when I think about this economic philosophy of extraction, and I understand that it started from the extraction of Africans from Africa to come into this country to build wealth, to not be paid, not for 10 years, not for a generation, hundreds of years of free labor. You must come to a conclusion about your own wealth. And friends, sisters, family, it's not an easy conclusion. In fact, it's really difficult, because while you have struggled every day to be the great, good, hardworking person that you are, the starting point and the foundation for who you are in this country is rooted in some sinister stuff. It's rooted in a legacy of enslavement. It's rooted in a legacy of extraction, and all of the accomplishments that we have in the middle class and in the upper middle class is actually not ours. It's actually not ours to claim. It's a hard pill to swallow. And so I want to acknowledge that. And I want to acknowledge that what I'm talking about is not really helpful to spin in. It's also not helpful to ignore or try not to acknowledge. In fact, we have to have the courage to tell the truth about where we come from. It will help us and hold us accountable to where we're going. And I think we still have the ability to go somewhere beautiful. But we're going to have to do a little bit more truth telling, and that's around the industries that are accelerating the climate crisis we are now experiencing. Let me just honor the communities in Lake Charles, the communities in Port Arthur, Texas, the communities in between, the tribes, the families, the churches who have all been hit by Hurricane Laura and are still recovering now. Let me honor and acknowledge the communities of Mobile, of Pensacola, all of the communities and families in between, to acknowledge that we are sending you love from your hit with Hurricane Sally. And let me send love to our friends on the West Coast, three states of fires, friends, 3 states of fires. They tell me that the standard they have, it's called a particulate index. It says if it's 50 on that standard, you can't, it's poor for human health. They were at 250 parts per whatever of particulate matter in the air. Your lungs can't take that. They can't take you ingesting all of what is in the air. 250. This unsafe level was 50. They were at 250 in Oakland. They were at 250 in Oregon. This is too much. We have floods, we have fires, we have hurricanes, we have a pandemic. If you did not believe the Lord was talking, I do believe that we are hearing from the Lord right now. It is our opportunity and our duty to make some changes. And those changes should be rooted in the very faith that so many of us espouse to have. But it cannot be silent, and it cannot be still, and it certainly cannot spend any time making excuses or being in denial of what is. We have to have the courage to tell the truth about what is happening right now, what is happening today. And then, friends, we have to move out of guilt, out of sorrow, and even move within the pain that we might be experiencing in this truth and still make something better. And I think make something beautiful. We have to acknowledge that our economic system it literally incentivizes unlimited growth and unlimited consumption. This is us as Americans in the world and how we see not just how we should live our lives, but how we should run our businesses. Unlimited everything. You can have whatever you want. This is a problem. And the world is paying a price for it. Extractive industries like oil and gas, big agriculture, textiles, they yield the world's highest profits. The strongest, biggest companies in the world right now are oil and gas companies or companies that are making massive amounts of products, mostly for wealthy people in the global north to consume. This is about us shifting how we live our lives and what we demand from whatever economic system we choose to have run our precious, precious country. And I'm not certain that capitalism, at least the racialized capitalism that we see right now, is the most effective way to do it. These extractive industries yield the highest profits, and they also release megatons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for just a little bit of energy. And if you don't know what greenhouse gases are, they break down like this. There are gases, there are things that are emitted in all of this work, all of this extraction, all of this drilling and mining. There are lots of things emitted into the air. Those particulates I'm talking about, but sometimes even finer than that. Gases, fumes emitted into the air. And when they're emitted into the air, sometimes the things that are going up are greenhouse gases. And these are the particular types of chemicals that if they get caught and when they get caught in the Earth's atmosphere, they simply they fill up. It's like filling up the globe. They cause the Earth to get warmer. We are experiencing global warming, not because of sun rays and not because of the natural movement of things. We are experiencing global warming because of human activity, because of consumption of the global north, because we want to be comfortable at all times. We want what we want the choices we want air condition, we want jets, we want everything. And the globe is now paying the price for the comforts of a very few people on this planet who want to live a certain way and now the whole planet has to pay for it. Climate change is real. Climate change is now, and if you have not yet felt the impacts of what is happening, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an international body, wrote a report 2 years ago that now gives us 10 years before we reach a point of no return, before we create a feedback loop in our own ecosystems that we cannot get out of. This thing is real. It's happening. And when you have a pretty day outside, you don't get to forget about it. You've got to understand that what we're feeling, what we felt in Katrina, were emissions that went out in the 50s and 60s. What we're feeling now in Sally are emissions that went out in the 80s and 90s. We have not yet begun to feel the enormous amount of greenhouse emissions that have happened since the 90s into today. And we have now several years of leadership that simply continue to increase the emissions we are putting into the air. This has got to stop. This must be our action. This must be our stance. And it is our duty as Americans to the rest of the planet, because we are a major cause of this. Even those of us who are struggling in poverty, we are struggling in poverty in a society rooted in systems that is causing imbalance around the globe. The industries at the heart of the climate crisis are the same industries that have been poisoning Black and brown and Native and poor communities for generations. When we talk about COVID and the mortality rate of Black folks and the Harvard study that says if you have exposure to poor air, this pandemic will harm you. This is the dots being connected between the same industry that extracts and refines and puts fumes and poison into the air. This is an acknowledgement that it is weakening our bodies and our ability to fight what is coming our way. And this pandemic, my friends, my family, my loved ones, is not the last. Pandemics have been part of the climate change conversation because as we lose frozen tundra and permafrost and all of this stuff that exists way north of South Louisiana, as we lose that ice, as we lose these formations, there are things being released into the air, pathogens, these things that can harm us and we cannot see. This is not the end of the fight. This is the beginning. And Katrina, 15 years ago, was a warning shot. But I don't think we're in the warning shot phase anymore. I think, in fact, with 10 years before we reach a point of no return, we are now officially in the game. And we need more folks working to combat climate change and to advance climate solutions from the front lines. Right now, what's predicted for the planet is that we will have a 3 to 4 degree temperature rise of all of our global surface and surface temperatures. Now, that doesn't sound like much, I recognize, but if there are any mothers who can hear my voice, maybe understand it like this. When you have a fever at 99 degrees, maybe you're concerned if you go up 1 degree. So now you're at 100. Things are bad. 100-degree fever is something to worry about. Our Earth is on track for 105. 105 fever. And what will your body do at 105? It will convulse. It will fight. It will sweat. It will shed. There will be delusions. This is what's happening to our planet. Right now, there are people fighting to keep us under 1.5 degree of change. And even if we are successful in staying below 1.5 degree of change, even if we're successful, we will see massive casualties. We will see collateral damage across the globe. We will lose food systems and water systems and communities and people with 1.5 degree of change. We are slated for 4. We are slated for 4 degrees. Our fever will go higher. And the globe, the people on the globe, may not survive. We are talking about an existential threat. We are not talking about the small little pieces of our society and the things you don't like about me and the things that frustrate me about you. We are not talking about that. If there was ever a time to deal with race and move and pivot, the time is now. The time is now. But we cannot move and pivot away from race as though it hasn't been part of these consequences we're feeling right now. We've got to acknowledge the role that it plays. And we've got to be aware of the role that it will play as climate change continues to impact our communities, and what it means for recovery, and what it means for the right to return, and what it means for the right to remain. These are questions that we have to contemplate as a society. Yes, we need the engineers. Yes, we need these other pieces. But if we don't get this societal change right, if we don't acknowledge these harms, if we don't acknowledge the original sins of this country, we do not make it. We do not make it. Not one of us will make it if we don't make this change right now. This, my friends, will take a lot of courage. It'll take the courage for you to acknowledge how you consume, how you move, what you do. It'll take the courage for you to acknowledge, where does your wealth come from? How do you have what you have, and whose stolen land are you on? It'll take the courage to acknowledge how unreal race is and the very real race consequences that we have seen on television through 2020, with Black lives being shot and paraded on front of the television just so people who didn't believe before can believe us now. It's going to take a digestion of all of that before we can move together. And that's going to take courage, because we are not just pointing the finger at a company. We're looking in a mirror of our society, and we're asking ourselves, what kind of society do we really want to be? I think 2020 has shown us what kind of society we are now, but I am confident that we can use that just as starting point data and move up from there. I have confidence in my fellow Americans to make good decisions and good choices that are rooted in the humanity of people and the rights of Mother Earth to exist without being a commodity for wealth generation, without being a commodity for profit. We have allowed capitalism, racialized capitalism, profit, money, and economy to go ahead of humanity. This is where we are. This is where we are. This is a problem. We are not going to make it if we do not make some major changes. Let me offer the reason why people in the US should be at the forefront of this climate fight. Because it's important to understand that the wealthiest 10% of the world's population accounts for almost 60% of global consumption. And the average American consumes as much energy as 2 Japanese folks, 6 Mexicans, 13 Chinese, 31 Indians, 128 Bangladeshi, 307 Tanzanians, and 370 Ethiopians. One American consumes as much energy as 370 Ethiopians, people in East Africa, Black people in Africa, who are now feeling the effects of climate change, but are absolutely not the people consuming and accelerating this thing to the point where it is now. One American, our greed, as an individual and as a society, is a part of a global conversation, and therefore it has to be part of global accountability. And the global accountability goes all the way back to the colonizing moment of this country, where native and indigenous people of this land had their lands taken from them, their identity stripped from them, many of their families murdered and beaten and moved away. They were enslaved. If we don't acknowledge that part of this history, then we can't have honest and accountable conversations today with other nations who are experiencing the impact of not just climate change, but the injustice of climate impacts, the injustice of not being able to recover, the injustice of having to fight something that you didn't start. You have to deal with a consequence that you had no hand in building. That's where we are. Understanding race and power and privilege in this country is absolutely about this country, but it is about the globe. It's about a global society, and it's about what we must do as Americans to be good stewards of the earth and accountable partners in a global movement for human rights. We have to understand that a lot of the industries that many of us in South Louisiana and Texas are told to hold as holy are not holy. They are flawed like many things. And people like me have been able to access good education and other things because of these industries. There's no need to sit and just demonize them all day long, but there's got to be a point where we say, we are now clear that the impact of these industries is far worse than maybe we anticipated. We are clear that a shift has to happen, and we are ready to make that change. It's not the same thing as fighting for something that's killing us because we want to be on a particular political side, or we want to have a particular stance in the community, or because we have a fear of our job. That's not a good enough excuse. We're not playing games here. This is about the health of the planet, and we have to tell the truth about it. We have to tell the truth that there are ripple effects to this thing, and that the temperatures around us are getting hotter. The water around us is rising. The fires and the floods are here, and we have to be honest about that. That takes courage. That takes all of us. It takes an assessment and an understanding of race. It takes an assessment and an understanding of power in this country and how it's all going to play out, or else we will, on top of all of this nastiness, we will build something that we hope is good, but it will fail. It will fail. We've got to pull some of this out because this country also was built on strength. It was also built on love. It was also built on family. But those bad pieces and those good pieces are intertwined. We've got to pull them out. We've got to acknowledge what they are, and we've got to be able to pivot and move on from it. If you don't believe me in the timeline, I will tell you that the 5 hottest years on record are the last 5 years. The 5 hottest years on record are the last 5 years. And this year, I remember seeing the news where they announced the highest water surface temperature ever recorded in the Gulf was recorded in 2020. And from that, they said, we will have a busy year of storms. We are now on, I believe, number 25. Coming right at the Gulf Coast one more time. This is happening right now. The temperatures are already rising. The seawater, the sea is already rising. In Louisiana, we are experiencing land loss at one of the fastest rates on the planet. And we understand that this is going to mean a slow migration out from land where people have been living for hundreds of years. And I'm told that even some of you in the Dallas area right now are helping many folks who evacuated from Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Sally. Thank you. Thank you for that. But have we really contemplated what it's going to mean when millions of people from hundreds of storms and hundreds of fires start migrating? What do we think is going to happen? If we're not paying attention, if we're not acknowledging the truth of climate impacts, not just on the land, but on the people, if we're not acknowledging that the system has allowed the people to be in a racial wealth divide that does not allow them to ever really recover or get ahead or be okay, or even make the choice to move, what are we going to face? What are we going to face in the future? This can get bad if we don't address this now. And we cannot address this with just good intention. And we cannot address this with just sweeping over things and sweeping things under the rug. We can only address this with the truth. And we can only address this with a commitment to our own self-transformation. A commitment to self-transformation is something I learned from the Jemez principles, Jemez, Jemez principles. And the Jemez principles are a set of principles. They're very basic, but they're not easy. The principles say you have to do things like be inclusive, let other people speak for themselves. And you should really check it out if you want to learn how to engage in this conversation in a principled way. These are good principles to follow. There's one that sticks with me daily because I like to think of myself as, a decent human being. But there's a principle that says you have to have a lifelong commitment to self-transformation. Every day you have to get better. It reminds me of Pastor's opening comment about a perfected love of ourself, a perfected love of our family and our community, a perfected love of our state and our region and our country. A perfected love is not fueled by hate. They can't exist in the same place. And if we are followers of love, then we have to understand our adversary is hate. And this is going to require us, before we correct anyone else's hate, it's going to require us to deal with our own hate. And some of us have been taught to hate ourselves. Some of us have heard the rhetoric and we have ingested it and we believe it. And sometimes we spout the words that we expect to hear from our enemy about our own people, about our own communities. This is a colonized mind. This is what comes from living in a mainstream structure that is meant and used to maintain the race hierarchies. This is structural racism. When you ingest the bad things about your people, the stereotypes, the things that are put up, you are ingesting lies rooted in oppression, meant to keep you questioning the validity of the people that you are a part of, the humanity of the people that you come from. Self-transformation is going to require us to deal with the hate that we have inside. We don't even always know we got it in there. But what do you think lives in you when you grow up in a place built on hate? You think you got away from it? You did not. You did not, my friends. And while it is important to pray and meditate so that you can be the best example of Christ's love that you can be, it is important to also acknowledge that in addition to living in a Christian society, we live in a human one, and it has some real shortcomings. And some of that, even if it just permeated through your skin, is in you. And you have to deal with it. And we don't have to circle in it. We don't have to spin in it. We don't have to sit in guilt. But we do absolutely have to acknowledge and get it out of there. The self-transformation that we all have to do, it is absolutely starting with yourself before you point the finger at anybody else, before you talk about anybody else's imperfections. You must strive to be a better human every day. And a better human in this day and time means you cannot be silent when Black people are killed on your television set. It means you cannot be silent when laws are being rolled back to allow more emissions to go in the air due to economic recovery. You cannot be silent in the face of these severe storms of race and climate change. You can no longer be quiet. The root causes of this are extractive economies, mass production, mass consumption, but they are also white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, and oppression. The root causes of the climate problem are the same root causes of our social imbalance. We have to address these things, friends. We have to address it with courage. We have to have a vision for climate justice. And this is not just about what we have to do for those who are vulnerable. This is what do we have a responsibility to do for this globe that is now feeling the effects of industrialized nations and comfortable societies that have now wreaked havoc on the globe. We have a duty, and I will close by using a quote from Bishop Desmond Tutu as I ask people to join the fight for climate justice. Bishop Desmond Tutu says, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And so this, my friends, is not a moment where you get to just contemplate the words that I'm saying to you. This is a moment of choice. We either work towards that perfected love that Pastor mentioned, or we acknowledge that the system, as broken, as sinister, as wrong, as oppressive as it is benefiting you to the point where you're going to uphold it. And while I will hate to see you on the other side of the battlefield, I commit to seeing you there as I've committed my life to this process and to this fight. This is the fight of our generation, and it will start with love, and it will end with climate solutions. And I believe that we still have the ability to love each other, to support each other, and to protect each other. And I think that if we do that, we'll have nothing to lose. Thank you.
My mic went on. Thank you. We were all clapping here, the few of us here in the production studio. And yes, we're overwhelmed and all charged up. Thank you so much. Yes, we've had lots of questions, lots of comments. I'm trying to figure out where to start. I love the fact that you pulled back around to self-transformation and with when Stan talked about moving towards perfection and how that has to be a lifelong commitment. So the question is, how do we recover the lifelong commitment? How do we acknowledge the hate or the disdain for something within us that we don't even think that is there?
Yeah, what I heard was, how do we acknowledge the hate that's in us that we don't know is there? The way I would answer that question, the way I've been doing it for myself, I hope it'll be helpful for you. Thank you for the question. I had to do a lot of self-reflection. I had to do a lot of reading and critical questioning to myself. I had to sit and listen a lot more, right? And ask myself the question, why does this make me uncomfortable? Why does this make me angry? What is it about this that's inside of me and causing me to react? And I had to really start looking at even the way I spoke, even the words I used to talk to people. Why do I use particular words? Why don't I use more pleasant words? Why don't I try to shift myself? What happens if I try? Maybe I can do it, maybe I can't. But I think that process of self-reflection is difficult because, the culture of competition and individualism that we have is really about being better than the other person. So what we're really good at is assessing the other person. What we're terrible at is assessing ourselves and where we are. And generally, we're moving from, just how to always at least know where you are, if not get the upper hand. The self-reflection is something very different. You have to be really gentle with yourself because there's some stuff in you that you might not like when you're faced with it. I think our society looks the way it looks today because we have not been honest about things like mental health and mental health care and access to mental health care. I think that we all need a lot of therapy, if not more than that. If you just think about the number of traumas so many of us have withstood as individuals, and then you put on top of that the trauma of being in a particular group, say women or Black folks, it's a life full of trauma. And trauma inside of you festers into sometimes bitterness or hatred or fear. And all of those things have to be extracted. That's a good thing to extract. We don't need to replenish that. You could just expel that and push that out of there. But I have begun to deepen my spiritual practice. In fact, I am honored to be with so many of the Methodist women, so many of the times when I give my speeches, because this is a place where I get to ask for prayers. I get to sit in contemplation. I get to ask someone next to me for a place in the Bible to get me started on my own reflection. I think we have good tools at our hands. We're just not using them for the right reasons. We're using everything we have right now to dominate, when we should be using what we have to create that perfected love, to create a better world, to create a better person, so that when we meet God one day, we can get a good nod in there and say, I did the best I could, Lord, and it was good. That's how I would answer that question.
Okay, thank you. So many great ideas and new ways of saying things, like racialized capitalism. So when we realize, and we've heard it before, that we live in the country that has all this wealth, the concentrated wealth, but the average person goes, well, yeah, but not me. Of course, we think that, but if we compared ourselves to someone in another country, a non-industrialized country, of course, we would be much, much better off. But here, we feel like, what power do I have? How is my little teeny tiny recycling or something going to help? So the question is, how do our little tiny differences making a difference? Do our little tiny steps make a difference? What are we supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
Simple question. You only have 30 seconds.
Simple question. Yeah. I mean, I think if we look to nature to answer some of these questions, we'll find what we need. Is there anything in nature that moves in little tiny ways but does big things? I think there are thousands of examples of how entire landscapes can be changed by a beetle or a beaver or something like that. The truth of the matter is, if you do anything with intention and consistency, you can make change. And I think we have to be honest about the power and wealth we do have. But it's an important acknowledgement too for the average person who doesn't feel like they have that much money. Yeah, where is the money we're talking about? You should be asking questions. If we can push out the stats that we're pushing for this country and you're not seeing any of the money and you're in the middle class, you should be asking a question about where is that money? Because that 1/10 of 1% having more wealth than 75% of this country, that should concern you. That doesn't sound like democracy. That sounds like a kingdom. Mm-hmm. And if we're living in someone's kingdom, I know many of you signed up to live in someone's kingdom, but I don't think it's this 0.1%. And so we should be questioning, where is this wealth? But we should also acknowledge that we live in a country that has a lot of power. And whether you feel like you have that power or not is not the question. You have it. You're an American citizen with the power to vote. You have the power to make change. You're an American citizen with the power to change your consumption habits. Yes, recycling and all of those little things are the very least you can do. That's if you choose to do nothing. You should go to full recycling, buy no more styrofoam, buy no more plastic, buy in bulk. You should be doing that just to be a good human on the planet. But if you want to talk about change, and I've seen the Methodist women go to the state capitol, this has to be the agenda. We want to stop all of the things that are harming our communities and harming our earth. We want to advance things that are helping people to create more sustainable lives. This actually puts you in line with movements on the ground, whether you like their slogan or not. What they're saying is to take the money from the bad stuff that's harming us and put it into the stuff that can make us stronger. And that's the advocacy that we all need to do. At the very least, you better vote and yes, I said better, but I mean that with love. Excuse me for getting a little hot. You please vote.
Yes.
And after you vote, you have to get engaged in the movements that are on the ground. This does not mean make your own movement. This means learn to follow the leadership of Black and Indigenous people who are leading massive movements across this country and others, and get behind them and stand with them and make sure they have what they need in order to make the change from the bottom up.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, we're all about voting. That is great. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions, and you kind of fed into 2 or 3 of them, so I feel like I'm taking a change here. But at one point you said, look in the mirror, and we need to see these issues are right here. But often we feel like other people must be using other mirrors. So the question is, what can we do to address the denial of reality of climate change and man's role in it? I mean, it's a divisive place.
What can we do to address the divisiveness? You know, I appreciate that question, because the first thing that popped into my head was Jesus. I used to love, I passed by my old church today, and I saw people coming out of Sunday school, and I used to love going to Sunday school. And I remember every time we had to read, the Passion, or an act or whatever, I always remember, like, what kind of courage does it take to tell the truth in the face of power? What really state of mind must you be in order to tell the truth to someone who could take your life, to someone who has some sort of power over you? We have to be more courageous. It doesn't matter what mirror anybody else is looking in. It matters what mirror you're looking in. Because sometimes we use that so many people are looking in a different mirror as an excuse to not do anything. There are no more excuses. Yeah. If you have to stand alone on a corner and profess the truth about climate change and what we must do about it, that is your charge. God's green earth is on the line. If you're going to fight for anything, this is the fight. And the courage that it takes has been given to us and shown to us in parables, in scripture. We know what to do. We don't need any more examples of courage. We have it. Open that holy book and get your examples of courage. And make sure that when you're standing and you feel alone, that you enter a state of prayer and you call the Holy Spirit, not because we need to use religion to keep people away or tell people who is not invited or talk about whatever kind of choices people are making, but because we're going to use religion as a beacon to see everybody who's standing with me to tell the truth. This will be God's army for climate change. This will be God's army for climate solutions. And that always starts with one person. It will be lonely. It will be difficult. If you're looking for any answers to any of these questions that equal, oh, just do this, turn that on, turn that to the right, and then you'll be there, you will not get them from me. That is not the place we're in. That's not the reality we're facing. What we have to do will be hard, but it is not impossible, and it is absolutely our duty.
Okay, thank you. And when you said, yes, this place, the place in which I'm sitting, is a place where absolutely everyone is welcome. And what you're saying is we're all in this, well, obviously we're all in this together, but we need to join together. And as people of faith is a great thing, but let's face it, we're all citizens of this world, and we should all feel that pain, and it takes all those little steps. So to circle back to steps with our elected officials to address these social construct barriers, not just positions, but we need to contact our people that we have elected or not elected, but let them know how we feel. And vote, 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 vote. We're all on that. Yeah. So I know we're almost done here. I want to ask, together as an organization, whether it be a small group with in your own small group of whatever sort, or a church, what do you suggest we do to help mobilize or energize people to take these small steps and act empowered together.
Thank you for that question. You know, the first thing I want to say is there is a movement happening across the South, and it's around what's called a Green New Deal. Now, some of you might hear that and go to a piece of policy at the federal level.
Right.
That's true, that existed, but that's not what we're talking about. There's a movement around how the unique reality of the South needs to be a part of how we address climate change, how the communities and workers on the front line need to be the first folks who benefit from a shift in our economy and a shift in the way we do things, and how equity and justice have to be at the center of the change that we're making. And so I would ask everyone to join Gulf South for a Green New Deal if you're in Texas or Louisiana, but there's also Southern communities for a Green New Deal. There are movements happening, not rooted in politics, but rooted in a reality and a unique reality of Southern people, which is us declaring for ourselves what we want to do. There's a process here that you can join, and there's a process here that you can start yourself. But what we need most of all is for folks to start engaging in changing the rules of our society, which are the laws. The rules of our society are meant to maintain the very mainstream power that you see now. If you see any injustice in the community, in anything, in any of the TV that you've seen over the last few months, if you see any injustice, you must understand that all things, all systems are moving the way they are designed to move. We have to design new systems. That means we have to build new communities. We have to learn how to govern ourselves and make decisions. And it can't always just be majority versus minority. Sometimes we have to work on things called consensus and make sure that when we move together, not competition, but collectivity. And this is really, really difficult for generations of people who have been invested in to believe in our own individual value, our own individual power, our own individual selves. We only ask the question of what we can't do when we're talking about change. But that individualism is with us every other moment of the day. What I want to do today, how I want to feel, what I want to do to be comfortable. That's how we're moving. And we have to shift ourselves to a more collective nature, to one that asks, if there's anyone in my community that doesn't have a house, a place to sleep, food to eat, access to healthcare, what do I need to do to change that so that that is not the case? Those are the changes we have to make. And they can't just be rooted in, well, this is the way it always is, or we don't have any power to change that. We need a new attitude, friends. We need a new attitude for this one that says we will not stop until we see equity and justice for everybody, starting with the Black woman sitting in her house sleeping and killed by the very people who have the authority that the people entrusted them with. We cannot start with anything else until we address the original sins of this country to Native American, to Indigenous people, and to Black people. And from there, we build the whole system up from the bottom, a new one, a better one, if not in clear, perfect moves, at least in restorative justice, at least in restoration. At least we start from an acknowledgement of harm and a repair of that harm. That's how we get this moving. That's how we move.
Thank you so much, Colette. I want everyone to know that this was a bold conversation where we like to come together to listen to the stories and learn and take that in. And I believe we've all heard a lot of stories that challenged probably what was in there already, but new stories that made these issues real to us. And the next step is to advocate, listen, learn, and advocate. And I encourage everyone, along with Colette, that's to be bold. Now is the time to be bold, and there's not much time. There's no time to waste. Get on with it. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have Donna is going to close us out with a prayer. And also there's, you can make donations to the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy. And if you'd like to have some resources that we've gathered together, you can email us at this email address. If you have more comments, that's fine too. Thank you very much. Donna?
Sure. Wow, wow. It's just incredible. Colette, what kind of truth you have spoken tonight from so many different directions. So first, I want to thank United Methodist Women, led by Wendy Campbell, the incredible amount of boldness they show in event after event as they take on the toughest and the most important issues in our world today. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, United Methodist Women, for who you are, for your history, and for the work that you are about. We love you, and we are so grateful for you and for what you do. And Colette, I want to say a word to you of appreciation. Oh, my goodness. Your journey, your courage, your strength, your calling. Oh, it's such a calling. And we are going to continue. I'm going to pray tonight, but we're going to also continue to pray for you in the future, that your work, that God will bless your work, and that he will open doors, and that he will bring the right people into your life, people of power that can impact change in major, major ways, and that all of the things that you are about will continue. And I loved what you said about United Methodist Women. You're right, they're your kind of women. That's right. So this link that has begun will be continued in the future, and we will be praying for you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And just to have a little summary here, I just have to say a reminder of the things she said, just a few. Racism is real. Racism has real consequences. Don't we all have the right to receive the recovery that comes from some? We must make change. We cannot be silent. We must have the courage to tell the truth and to speak the truth in power to those who need to hear it. We must face the pain. We must go inward ourselves and as a country. As she spoke tonight, it was as if God was giving us an x-ray of our country and looking at the soul of our country and revealing us both the good but also the bad, that which we need to change. So let us have the courage to face the pain, face the uncomfortableness, and so, as she put it, something beautiful can come out of that. Give us the courage to face the systems in place, the power systems in place that prevent change from happening. May we see those, call them for what they are, and do our part to change them. Climate change is real. It is urgent. We must face that, and we don't have long in which to do this. Let us acknowledge our part as individuals and as a country, and may the United States as a country step up and use the strengths that we have, the incredible resources here, the incredible economic opportunities here to address the racial divide and the economic divide, and to make this country the kind of country that God is calling us to and that God wants for us. And finally, may we go on that journey of transformation that she invited us to. Oh, I want to go there. I'm going to go there. And I'm going to take other people with me. We are going to look at ourselves individually. We're going to look at all those barriers that keep us from being the person that God created us to be. We're going to look at the anger. We're going to look at the things we tend to deny, the need to be first, the need to be right. She said we live in a comparison culture, and that's so true. So we're going to look at our needs that keep us from knowing we're loved and accepted by God, and which keep us from loving fully those around us, especially those who we feel sometimes are different from us. Make us into a family, oh God, into a new kind of family where we do truly love. So you can tell I am revved up, and that I do want us, did you hear that? And I do want us to go forward now. Let us receive the benediction. Oh God, we do come to you most of all tonight, wanting to confess our brokenness, our humanity, our need to be first and right, our need to please other people, especially people in power. We confess. Oh, how we need Jesus, as Colette reminded us. He faced all of this, and he showed us how. Showed us how to be human, showed us how to love, showed us how to face pain, and showed us how to change and become transformed. We as Christian women know this in our hearts and souls, and of course the men know it also too. So we thank you, oh God, and may we step up and step out into those doors you're going to open for us, into those ways you're going to help us as we make changes. May we move forward, and may we move forward as a church. Oh, let us not go backwards. Let us not go into denial. Let us not repeat the mistakes of the past, but instead go forward as your children, as your sisters and your daughters and sons in Christ, ready to face truth and face power with truth as Jesus did. Send us forth, bless us all, and give us the kind of journey ahead that only you can give us. In Jesus' name we pray and we go. Amen.